really the point of sodium here is to balance what you're doing from a fluid perspective. And so think fluid first and then think, what sodium do I need to match up with what I'm doing from a fluid perspective?
Thanks for listening to this episode of Fuel In Sessions, where I have an in-depth conversation with our very own Dr. Alan McCubbin. And we're talking explicitly about a recent review paper that he completed on sodium. So the use of sodium on a daily basis before exercise, during and after exercises, and what recommendations are available in the current research. This podcast is the first of three because the paper is so in-depth. We couldn't do it all in one episode. We break it down in the order of the actual research paper, and you can get that paper via the link in the show notes, and so you can follow if you wish to do it that way. But it is incredibly detailed. There is a little bit of geeking out with the science, but there's plenty of practical takeaways that you will gain in this very first episode, where we cover daily or habitual intake of sodium on a daily basis versus pre-exercise session sodium intake and what that means for athletes. So sit back, get out your pen and pencil, and enjoy the conversation that I have with Alan. I'm your host, Scott Tindal, and today I am once again joined by my colleague, Dr. Alan McCubbin. Al, how are you doing, mate?
Pretty good. A bit rusty, though. It's the first call I've jumped on this year. So, I had to dust off the microphone and the headphones and remember how to put it all together.
Yeah, actually, that's a very good point. I think you will be my first Fuel In Sessions for 2026 as well. So, mate, this is a big one, actually, and probably it's going to come out with a little bit of controversy, I guess, and some people may get... there's always going to be the fanatics, isn't there? There's going to be the people who get a little bit upset. There's always going to be, oh, no, but this works for me. Yeah, that's the beautiful thing about nutrition. And we've seen recently with some guidelines and things like that, people get very irate about guidelines. And I think the point about guidelines is that they're a guide. And yes, there will be some individual nuances associated with it. But in saying that, what we're going to be talking about today is sodium. And sodium is one of those nutrients, I guess, that gets a lot of coverage, especially in sport and in particular endurance sports. And it's one of the ones that probably people get pretty passionate about as well. And, I'll paraphrase something from the study, which we are going to cover. And actually, before I even do that, let's just say what we're talking about today is Alan's brilliant review on sodium. And that review is authored by Alan McCubbin, Sodium Intake for Athletes Before, During and After Exercise, Review and Recommendations. It's in the Journal of Performance Nutrition, and it was published in 2025, I think in November. Is that correct?
October.
Okay. So I'm going to paraphrase something, a sentence from the paper, and it said, a common focus of team and endurance sports nutrition has traditionally been on what athletes use or lose during exercise, i.e. carbs, water, and sodium. And I think that's brilliant, Al, because that is literally what we do, isn't it, when we're talking performance nutrition and, as you said, with team and endurance athletes. And what we want to focus on today is, in particular, sodium, and go through the review. And I love the way the paper was set out. So what we're going to do today is actually just go through the paper under the titles of how you split it out and just cover each and every one and get your perspective on it. And obviously I'll put in my little 2 cents here and there, and sort of break that down, certainly from a geek out perspective. So anyone listening, if you want to get into the weeds, we probably will get a little bit into the weeds, but hopefully not too much. But we'll also break that down into practical elements, and make sure that you go away from each episode on this with, what did that mean and what does it mean to me? And we're going to break this paper up actually into 3 episodes, because I was talking to you, Al, about this, and I didn't want to do it injustice by trying to rush through this in a single session. So we're going to lay it out. Today we're going to cover daily sodium requirements and also sodium intake before exercise. In the subsequent fueling sessions, episode 2 is going to be sodium intake during exercise, including how to make sodium intake recommendations. And I think that's going to be a really big one. Obviously, people want to understand that. And sodium intake after exercise. And then probably episode 3 would be covering devices on the market that assess sodium loss and maybe other ways in which you can do that as well. And then obviously future research and what it means for athletes. There's a lot of noise around sodium, I think, probably mainly driven by marketing for companies. I think that's probably the reality of it. And, it's understandable. I think what you also did in the paper, which was really great, was actually outline the lack of clarity on guidance. And so I think everyone really appreciated when we read your paper some of that guidance and trying to actually clarify what is there. And as you pointed out, the American College of Sports Medicine position statement on nutrition for athletes, they say sodium should be replaced when large sweat sodium losses occur, yet they don't quantify how much should be replaced, the goal of replacement, or how to know if actually enough's been replaced. So I think even though these guidelines exist, they are actually very ambiguous, I think, in the way they say it. And so, again, credit to you, Al, for having a go and attempting to do what I guess no one else has done in the world of sodium. So I'll shut up for a second and let you join in.
Yeah. And I think, to be fair to the people who wrote those guidelines, there was simply just a lack of research evidence at the time that those guidelines were written. So the most recent ACSM guidelines were published in 2016, so that's 10 years ago now. And then the hydration-specific ones were 2007, I think it was. So, almost 20 years ago now. So, I think, a bit has changed during that time. A lot of the focus, I think, up until that time was around sort of perfecting the sweat testing process and trying to perfect the way of quantifying how much sodium is being lost during exercise, as opposed to, okay, now we know how much you lose. Now what? What do you actually do with that number, and how do you replace it? And so I sort of came into academia and focused from a research perspective around sodium around that sort of 2015, 2016 period. And so, and it's not just me, obviously others are working in the area as well. And so I think there has been some steps forward in terms of our understanding in the last 10 years. And I think that probably reflects the ability to create some guidelines now that we couldn't back then.
Yeah. I think, as you point out, even in the paper, there's an improvement in the research, but there's still probably a lot lacking. So you do the best you can, and we'll go from there. So
yeah, and I think the commercial aspect to that, just coming back to that comment you made before, I think whenever there's, I guess, a lack of clear guidance, there's sort of like this vacuum of information, something is inevitably going to rush in and fill that void. And in this case, it's very much been the companies that produce the products. And to be fair, to some extent that's necessary, because, we're not saying from any of this that you shouldn't consume sodium or that it's, harmful or anything like that. So, those products do need to exist and people do benefit from them. So if there's no official guidance coming around about how to use them, well, they have to provide something. So, I think what we're now doing is starting to fill out that gap, and rather than using just stuff that people have created really from interpretations of the limited science, is actually try to improve that science and therefore improve those recommendations.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, I think we're always the first to say that the field is often outpacing the lab. And so some of these companies were born from probably most of them have been created by an athlete generally as well, when you look at them, and what they suffered, and then created a product to try and combat whatever it is they suffered, and then extrapolate the existing evidence, apply it to the potentially N equals 1, and then hopefully build on that. But I think some of the blanket statements around sodium replacement have probably been blown out. And so I think that's where it's a really good segue actually to even get into it. So the first part of your paper, the review, was talking about day-to-day sodium intake. And I think this is an area that I'm pretty passionate about actually. I'm very pro sodium intake for exercise, I would say. I'm probably more in the pro category when required. I think, yes, there is an overconsumption by a lot of athletes and you actually reduce their total sodium intake. You still consume some and they actually feel a bit better because maybe they were overdosing on sodium. But when it comes to day-to-day, I do get a little bit concerned about, let's talk Gen Pop first, popping sodium packets every day, and then probably even athletes popping this. So I see this quote all the time on social media, and now because I've obviously clicked on it and talked about it, my phone obviously just sends everything to me. But 4/5 of Australians suffer from dehydration. And I'm sure you've seen this quote as well. What's your thoughts on it?
Yeah. So I think where this comes from, and again, this is the classic, I think, marketing latching onto a statistic or a bit of data and then using that to make some claims that are pretty wild sometimes. Look, I think this comes back to official guidelines or recommendations about how much fluid the general population should drink per day. And obviously this will be slightly different in different countries because each country has their own sort of dietary guidelines. Here in Australia, they're actually done in litres, but then the media and the general population tend to convert that into glasses of water, and that's kind of where the 8 to 10 glasses of water a day come from. Depending on, in the Australian guidelines, there is two different guidelines. There's one for water and one for fluid. Now, the difference being is that water can also come from the fruit and vegetables you eat, and there's water content in food as well. So the water requirement is actually higher than the fluid requirement. The fluid is the additional fluid you need to drink to meet that water requirement. But I guess what it then looks at is, okay, well, how much do people actually drink in comparison to those guidelines? And you might say, okay, well, 4/5 of Australians don't meet those guidelines. Okay. Do they meet half those guidelines, 3/4 of those guidelines, 90% of those guidelines, or 10% of those guidelines? So to say that they suffer from dehydration, quote unquote, is very different from saying they're falling 10% short of the official recommendations for water intake. So I don't think it's fair to say that 80% of Australians are walking around clinically dehydrated. I think we would see a spike of hospital admissions and all sorts of problems if that was the case.
Yeah, it's sort of the mass hysteria around a particular statistic. And I will just say also that when people see these statistics, maybe check the source of the statistic, because this statistic actually came from 2023 article in Retail Pharmacy magazine, and it was produced by a company called Hydrolyte, which is actually it's an electrolyte-based product. So, again, is there a little bit of bias potentially in where that statistic came from? Yeah, I would suggest that. So, and I think to your point, Al, like, okay, you may miss the 8 to 10, but it doesn't mean you're dehydrated and you're not requiring an IV drip or anything like that. So, again, I think it's thinking about what these statistics are you see on social media and then thinking, okay, how does that apply to me? Do I need to suddenly consume a hell of a lot of sodium to actually become hydrated, or do I perhaps just need to drink 1 or 2 extra glasses of water on a day-to-day basis, and then I'll actually be in a euhydrated state, which of course is a lot cheaper than buying an expensive product that may be unnecessary to consume on a daily basis.
Yeah, and what's happened with this focus around, people aren't drinking enough water is that this multi-million-dollar giant drink bottle industry has popped up. You see things like, this is a relatively small one compared to some of the ones I see people walk around with. And this was one I was given for a job I did, and I don't even use it because it's so massive. I have no need for it. It's just a pain to carry around. But, it's the typical, here's a problem. People aren't drinking enough water. Let's not worry about how much they're under, because it might only be a glass or 2. Let's solve that by bringing out half-gallon water bottles and encouraging people to wander around all day with these things because they're scared of being dehydrated sitting at a computer in an office.
Well, that then leads into the other quote which I see, which is water doesn't hydrate you. And you're like, I mean, you read that and you're like, that can't be. I mean, it's sort of like vegetables are killing you or bananas make you fat sort of type statement. I mean, can you explain this ridiculous statement? And it probably relates to even, the solution. People are dehydrated. Okay, let's give them these huge bottles of water. The solution to that problem then becomes a problem in that water doesn't hydrate you because of an extreme bolus of water. Can you just explain that in a little more detail as to why drinking huge amounts of water may not hydrate you?
Yeah. So it comes back to this concept that we call osmolality, which is basically like the number of dissolvable particles within a fluid. And generally when we talk about osmolality in the body, we're talking about in the blood and the fluid that surrounds that. And that's how the body regulates the amount of water. So if we drink too much water, that osmolality falls because it dilutes all those particles. That signals through some hormones to our kidneys to flush out that excess water. When we become dehydrated, the opposite happens. We lose water. All the rest of those particles are in a greater quantity, so they become more concentrated. The osmolality goes up, and therefore we signal to our body to retain and conserve fluid. So this is, as you said, I think an example of where we had one problem where we're maybe a couple of glasses below what we should be drinking. We tried to solve that by drinking half a gallon of water. That was too much water. And if you drink a large bolus of water in one hit, it is going to dilute not just the sodium, but all the dissolvable particles in your blood. That lowers the osmolality, sends signal to the kidney that I'm overhydrated, flush out the water. And so what we see in research, both before and after exercise or just in the general population, is if you get someone to drink a large volume of plain water and with nothing else, and then you look at their urine output over the sort of couple of hours afterwards, they basically pee out all of the water that they just drank and sometimes even more. And so then the solution to this was, okay, well, we had a problem that we didn't quite drink enough water. So rather than just trying to fix that gap, we drank too much water. That then created a new problem that we don't retain that water because we're drinking to this pattern that's the body's not designed to deal with. So we're now going to solve that problem by taking electrolytes to help retain that half gallon of water that we drank but didn't actually need.
Brilliant. We create a problem, we create a solution that creates a problem that then you need a solution for.
Well, you can't monetize common sense, can you?
That's brilliant. And so obviously the solution is actually drink your water, but just drink it a little bit slower and have some food in between on a day-to-day basis. And you probably won't require any of these fancy things like LMNT, which, I mean, I will talk about that product in particular because it absolutely grates me. It's literally table salt in a packet, 1,000 milligrams, and people are lapping it up for an extraordinary amount of money, popping it into their water on a daily basis with some, I think it's got some, it might have stevia or something like that, some artificial sort of type or natural flavors, I should say. And they're spending all this money on it, but it's actually not required on a day-to-day basis.
Well, they're just expensive salt sachets, aren't they?
It's just salt. Like get a pinch of salt if you want to have that. Just pop it in with a little bit of lemon juice.
And then, then there's the argument, but it's got other electrolytes. It's got potassium and magnesium and calcium and things.
Eat some food.
You get that at lunchtime.
Yeah, eat some food.
Yeah.
So I've had the rant about LMNT in particular, and hopefully they don't try and sue me, but I've got no money, so that's fine. What are the issues with day-to-day high sodium intake? And what is the evidence for this, and where does that evidence come from?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back decades now in terms of a very well-established link between high salt intakes and risk of high blood pressure or having higher blood pressure, increased risk of heart disease, increased risk of stroke at the extreme end. So in some countries that have very high sodium intakes, particularly in parts of East Asia, where very salty sauces and things are pretty standard fare in that cuisine. There's also a higher risk of stomach cancer, which some of that has been attributed to extremely high salt intakes as well. So, yeah, I mean, we've had public health messages for decades now encouraging people to consume less sodium. And it seems that since COVID, apparently that was completely wrong and we've turned it upside down and we're not eating enough salt. So, yeah, it's interesting.
And again, I just want to just keep in mind what we're talking about here is general population. So yes, I understand a lot of the listeners of Fuel In Sessions are athletes, but I think it is important for them to get, let's start with Gen Pop and understand that, and again, definition of an athlete, we will say anyone who exercises and sweats, we consider an athlete. Yet on that same, just remember, just because you are exercising and sweating doesn't necessarily mean that you need to, on a day-to-day basis, suddenly increase your sodium intake massively. And I think that, if we talk about assessments on Gen Pop, daily intake versus recommended sodium intake, and talk about milligrams, I think is probably the best, milligrams per day, because most people think about milligrams per day. What have you seen in the literature to date?
Well, most recommendations obviously vary a little bit from one country to the next, but generally they're around, or they recommend consuming less than about 2,500 milligrams of sodium per day. Some countries it might be 2,000, but somewhere sort of in that range. In most developed countries, people are consuming far more sodium than that on a day-to-day basis, and that's without any electrolyte supplements. So the typical values that you see, and this is captured actually using urine collection, and we can talk about that a bit later on and the significance of that because it is used a bit in research. For females, is about 3,000 milligrams a day, and males is about 4,000 milligrams a day. Actually, when you turn those into milligrams per kilo of body weight, they're almost identical, males and females. So it's just that the males are heavier, they consume more food, obviously have higher calorie needs, and therefore they get more sodium because of that. But in both cases, the average person in developed countries consumes more sodium than is recommended without supplementation.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking sort of, 1.5 times, even closer, getting up to 2 times the recommended amount. And I imagine a lot of, and we've heard, definitely recently, processed foods and the dangers of that. We talk more around calories and high energy intake as a result of those. But what you also see in a lot of those foods is fairly high sodium amounts to make it quite palatable, and they make you eat more and all those sort of beautiful things that those types of foods do. So probably a lot of people are unaware of how much sodium they're taking in on a daily basis if they're not eating potentially whole foods. But even, I guess, with whole foods, like cured meats, deli meats. And if I think of a large population of Fuel In users coming from America, I remember I did a talk on this and showed them actually the amounts of sodium in some of those deli meats. They were like, whoa, and it was sort of a question. I did a little hands up, who eats deli meats here? And I think 90% of the attendees were like, yep, I eat it. And I have no idea that that's how much I was consuming.
Yeah, and then there's a lot of foods that contain have a high sodium content that people don't even realize because they don't taste salty. I think about things like bread has a reasonable sodium content. Things like crumpets actually have quite a high sodium content. Sweet muffins, banana muffins or chocolate chip muffins and things like that, often have quite a high sodium content as well. And they're not things that you typically associate. They're not savory foods. But they still have quite a high sodium intake, and that contributes as well. So there are, definitely a lot of hidden sources of sodium in the typical Western diet, I suppose.
Yeah, and that's, and again, I always have, this thing, there's general population, but general population are still athletes. It's just that athletes are a different part of the general population, I guess. So, I still lump all the athletes into that sort of you probably are consuming more sodium than you think on a daily basis. And then you layer in, okay, you're an athlete. What have you observed and what did you find out when you were researching this around athletes and sodium intake on a daily basis?
Yeah, there's very little research in this area, and that comes down to how you actually measure sodium intake. So if you try and just complete a food record or something and estimate sodium from that, it is notoriously inaccurate. And you can imagine why, because if you think about you had a food that had, say, soy sauce. Obviously, soy sauce is very, very high in salt. And if you underestimate or overestimate the amount of soy sauce you added to whatever meal you're making by half a teaspoon, it's not much, but that's hundreds of milligrams of sodium a day that you've miscalculated your intake by. And so what we do to estimate sodium intake in the population is use urine collection. So we get people basically to collect all their urine for a 24-hour period. And then we measure the sodium in their urine, because about 90% of the sodium you consume in a day, assuming you're not exercising and sweating, and obviously we'll get to that, will be peed out again to maintain the balance ins and outs of sodium. A little bit will be lost in fecal losses. You lose a bit through your skin, like even without sweating, but about 90% you lose in your urine. There's now evidence that actually you need to collect multiple days to get an accurate picture, because it actually does fluctuate a bit day to day for reasons that are not to do with intake. But it's a reasonable measure across a large population. And so when you do population studies, you can get a reasonable view of that. There are almost no studies that have done that in athletes. I actually did that not for this purpose, but in hindsight, it was well designed. But we actually did a study where we were looking at the amount of sodium in someone's diet and how that affects their sweat sodium concentration. Again, we'll get to that later on, but we got them to collect all their urine just in their normal daily diet and got them to stop exercising for 3 days prior to coming into the lab. And so we have 3 consecutive 24-hour urine collections, and those were pretty similar to the general population, about 45 to 50 milligrams of sodium per kilogram of body weight. So pretty similar to the general population, really, that we saw. And this was a group of runners, cyclists, and triathletes.
Yeah, okay. And what in terms of athletes, though, like if we think about athletes and we think of athletic performance, and I'm thinking, well, there's a couple of things there, actually. You mentioned around estimation, something I'd love to bring in, and we've talked about bringing in the collecting the data on fiber, first and foremost through their food diaries in Scooter and Fuel In, which I think will come, and we'll get that in definitely sooner rather than later, probably hopefully in Q1. But there is always a lot of requests around sodium intake as well. Like, can we quantify sodium through their food diary? I guess I'm like, oh yeah, that would be really interesting. But I guess to your point, we'd have to a pinch of salt with it in terms of, excuse the pun, because, you know, as you say, some of these high salt or high sodium containing foods, if it is measured incorrectly, it could, you know, be quite either underestimate or overestimate. Maybe we put, you know, guidelines around that, I guess, to say, hey, if you are using soy sauce, let's really measure it and be accurate, to see if we can get an accurate measure. That would be fantastic, I think. It's probably the 2 most requested, you know, features, I think, with food logging: fiber and sodium intake, probably sugar as well, in terms of just refined sugar. But what about in terms of athletes? Obviously, in Fuel In, they're obviously concerned around, are they consuming enough energy, enough calories to meet their needs? As you perform exercise, you inherently, energy expenditure goes up. And depending on what your goal is, whether it's lose weight, maintain, or gain weight, you're going to have to eat more energy. What are the implications of consuming more energy, i.e. more calories, on sodium intake?
Yeah, well, like a lot of nutrients, I guess the more you eat, the more sodium you're going to get in your diet. I guess it depends a little bit on where those extra calories come from. If it's literally just adding pure sugar or something like that, then obviously no, or plain maltodextrin, you wouldn't have an impact. But as a general rule, the more food you eat, and that includes obviously the meals and snacks outside of training, the more sodium you're going to get in your day.
Yeah, and that makes me think, isn't it? 'Cause it's interesting because, like, then you think of like high performing athletes, like then we go into our competitive or pro elite type persona, and you often see those are the athletes consuming a lot of sodium in terms of in session and meeting their sodium requirements. Yet we also know their energy intake goes through the roof. And what we've also said is that with energy intake, sometimes that notion of clean eating is not possible to meet your demand. So then you go down the route of processed and ultra processed foods to actually get the calories in. As a result, taking in potentially a lot more sodium on a day-to-day basis. And I think that conundrum probably needs further research to actually assess what are these athletes who are doing, 20, 25, 30 hours a week training with their dietary intake. How is that impacting sodium intake? And then is there a need, for extra sodium on top of that if their daily intake is so high already.
Mm.
It's sort of a really interesting prospect.
Yeah, and I think we'll get to it in part two when we talk about during exercise. But I think it's when that sodium is taken and how is it taken relative to the ins and outs of water from the body. That's probably where that becomes more important. I don't think there's necessarily a concern there with those athletes consuming too much sodium in terms of health risk, because they're going to sweat a lot of that sodium back out again, and then the kidneys, we'll get into it in a sec, but they're going to sort of balance out the rest. Also remembering that these athletes are probably the people who are the lowest risk in the entire population of heart disease, stroke, etc. anyway. And this is only one of multiple risk factors. So it's not like saying, you have a high sodium diet, you're going to die of a heart attack or anything like that. It's just like your risk will be slightly higher. And in this particular group, I don't think that's the case. And we'll get into why in a sec.
Yeah, and I think that actually is a really good point when we did refer to high sodium intakes and the danger of cardiovascular disease, cancers and things like that. It is around sodium sensitivity, isn't it? And those individuals who are sodium sensitive and can cause hypertension and whatnot. That's correct?
Yeah. So in people with high blood pressure, about 2/3 of them are what we call salt sensitive. In other words, if you lower the sodium intake in your diet, blood pressure tends to drop. About 1/3 of the population don't for some reason, and we don't really understand why, and we don't really have any good way of predicting whether you're going to be salt sensitive or not. You have to go and, the way of measuring salt sensitivity in research is long and convoluted, and you would never do it in the real world. In the population that doesn't have high blood pressure, it's roughly the opposite. So about 1/3 are salt sensitive and 2/3 aren't, which suggests that the salt sensitivity in the first place may sort of increase your risk of having high blood pressure. And certainly, we've got a lot of fuel-in users of all different shapes, sizes, abilities, ages, etc. So, yeah, no doubt there will be fuel-in users out there. They might be in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s that are age group triathletes or whatever other sport they're doing that have high blood pressure, and that might be genetic to an extent as well. Who may be salt sensitive and benefit from a reduction in sodium intake. But there's also a lot of fuel-in users that probably having a bit higher than recommended sodium intake is probably of fairly little consequence as well.
For sure. It's still a high proportion, isn't it? 66% of people may be impacted by high sodium intake on a daily basis and impact a key measure of health, i.e. blood pressure.
So that's 2/3 of people that have high blood pressure already will respond to lowering their sodium intake.
For sure.
If you don't already have high blood pressure, only about 1/3 of the population will be sensitive to it.
Yeah, but my point being, if you do have high blood pressure,
yes,
a very high percentage of those could actually benefit from reducing sodium intake. And that's a large percentage, and probably the fault that a lot of athletes will make is maybe not even getting their blood pressure assessed because they're like, I'm an athlete, I don't need to get that, or I'm only 30. It's actually, it's amazing when you I speak to friends and that, and they go and actually get their blood pressure done, and they're sort of like, 160 on 120, is that all right? And you're like, no, that's not all right. And I'm not saying they're necessarily taking in a lot of sodium either, but maybe they're unaware of their sodium intake. And if they are then, caught in this loop of, I need to take sodium because it's good for me and it makes me hydrate properly, it's this whole, I guess, continuum, isn't it? And it's like trying to work out where does everything fit in? And, health is definitely at the forefront of, I think, most people's minds now. And I think COVID, if there was one benefit of COVID, it was probably that it made people aware of their health. I just think that sometimes we go looking for solutions where the answers are right in front of your face already.
Yeah. And I think definitely that's the case where, if you know you have high blood pressure or you have a family history of heart disease or something like that, that's probably where you would be much more conscious of, if you're an athlete as well, and maybe sort of feeling a bit conflicted of, I'm told I need to have sodium for my my hydration and my performance and all that sort of stuff, but I'm worried about the health impacts of that. I guess that's where trying to understand, what are your sodium needs? When is sodium actually going to be helpful versus when it's probably unnecessary? And then only taking the minimum amount that's actually needed to have any kind of benefit. And I guess over these 3 episodes, hopefully we'll get to that and people will understand, well, where is it likely to make a meaningful difference versus where is it unlikely to make a meaningful difference. And so if you're someone who's erring more on the side of, I need to be careful about my sodium intake from a health point of view, hopefully that'll help differentiate when I can maybe skip it versus when I probably do need to still focus on it a little bit.
100%. So if we're talking daily, just to wrap up the daily sodium, I think certainly from what I read in the review, and I'll get your take on this, but my take was that daily sodium intake really isn't required on a day-to-day basis. If you're eating food and if you're talking about hydration, drink your fluids, drink them slowly across the day. You don't have to chug liters and liters in the space of 30 minutes, and water will do its job. It will hydrate you if you do it fairly slowly, fairly consistently across the day, and eat some food in between. That was sort of my take from it. Certainly for general population, athletes may consume more sodium anyway than what they think, so therefore additional sodium on a day-to-day basis, again, maybe or probably isn't even required.
No, and I guess that comes back to something I alluded to before, and that is that the body's pretty smart at figuring out all this stuff. And I said before, the way we measure someone's sodium intake is to collect all their urine and measure the output. And our kidneys are extremely adaptable to a range of sodium intake. So if you eat a crap load of salt, you'll pee out a crap load of salt. If you have a very low salt intake, you'll pee out a very low amount of salt. And so the kidneys are going to balance out all those lumps and bumps in intake. And so if you have a lower sodium diet, you'll just pee out less salt. And if you have a high sodium diet, you'll pee out more salt. And so on the one side, you might say, well, it doesn't matter. My kidneys will just take care of it. But yeah, it does matter because it's what happens when it is in the body in that in-between time that can be potentially detrimental in terms of the blood pressure and the heart disease risk and everything we just talked about. But I guess what that's saying is that, if you're an athlete and you go out and do a lot of exercise and you're sweating a lot, I guess the common assumption, and I actually measured this as part of my PhD, we surveyed a whole bunch of people, and the overwhelming consensus was, because I'm an athlete, I need more sodium on a day-to-day basis than non-athletes because I'm losing all this salt in my sweat. But the flip side is, yes, but you're losing a lot less through your kidneys, through your urine, and that's okay. And so your kidneys are very good at compensating for what's happening in the sweat glands until you get to, multiple hours of exercise. And obviously we'll get into that in part 2.
Yeah, the body is a wonderful, what's the best way to describe it? A wonderful modulator, I guess, of what's going on inside. And often actually, it's like the whole toxin thing, isn't it? When you hear, I did a detox, you're like, well, I'm pretty sure your system already, your kidneys already are doing that. So
yeah. And to add to that, I guess, we keep trying to trick the body. The body's too clever for that.
Of course. It's evolved over a very long time to handle these things. So,
And I think the final thing I'll add to this is, there is this whole hysteria at the moment that water doesn't hydrate you. And it's just been the last, I reckon, since the end of COVID, that's certainly where I've seen it. Certainly here in Australia, that's what I've seen. But talking to colleagues overseas, it's been pretty similar. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, what about the last 300,000 years of humanity? Did water stop hydrating us in 2022? I don't know. It seems to have done its job over all these years prior to this.
Something in the water.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll move on. Before exercise. The next section in the paper was around before exercise. And I want to dive into the idea of sodium before exercise and the reasons why practitioners would recommend this and why also athletes believe or practice this ritual of pre-exercise sodium intake. Rationale 1 that was highlighted was sodium intake increases ad libitum fluid intake, improving pre-exercise hydration status. What's the evidence show for this, Al?
So firstly, just to explain for those who don't know what ad libitum fluid intake means, it basically just means how much you choose to drink without even really thinking about it. So if you just put fluid in front of someone and say, do whatever you want, you come back and measure how much they actually drink. That's ad libitum fluid intake. So I guess the easiest analogy I can give for this is the Seinfeld episode where they have that line, "Those pretzels are making me thirsty." You see it all around the world.
Hopefully we got some old listeners, because a lot of the young ones won't recognise that.
Well, it still does the rounds on every streaming service in the world, yeah. But or the bar that provides the salty snacks because it'll encourage people to drink more, that kind of thing. So it's that idea that if you give people salt or salty food, they'll be thirstier and actually desire more fluid. And, we can demonstrate this through intravenous saline studies. You can give people concentrated saline that increases the amount of sodium in your blood. That will make people thirstier. It will make them drink more. It makes them also conserve fluid, as in you pee out less as well. Interestingly, when you actually go to give the sodium and the fluid orally rather than intravenously, the results are a little bit more of a mixed bag, depending on how the studies have been designed. So some of the studies obviously have wanted to blind this, so they've given the sodium in capsules so you can't actually taste it. You do see beneficial effects there, but they're usually very large amounts of sodium. Once you give the sodium in food, the results are a little bit more variable. So there is a study, and again, this is general population, but prior to exercise, it's at rest, so it's just as relevant. They've used like salted nuts versus unsalted nuts, for example, or nuts like sugar-coated nuts as well, and didn't actually see a benefit. And I think one of the reasons potentially for that is, once you start giving higher calorie food, it's going to slow down the emptying from the stomach, and so that salt's actually not getting into the blood as quickly. So yes, it may result in more drinking, but it's going to play out over a much longer period of time rather than the couple of hours that they measured in that study. So there's that impact in terms of that salt getting into the blood, raising that osmolality and making you feel more thirsty. So that's kind of that physiologically driven thirst or drive to drink more. So certainly if you take a lot of sodium, that is probably going to happen to an extent. The other part of this is more around palatability. So it's not about that sodium getting into the blood. It's simply what it tastes like in your mouth and whether you find that pleasant or not, and whether that actually encourages you to drink more of whatever the fluid is. So for that, the sodium probably has to be in the fluid rather than separate from the fluid in terms of food or capsules or whatever it is. Overall, probably, yes, it does drive you to drink a little bit more, but I think it is also very situation specific. So, for example, a lot of age group triathletes wake up quite early in the morning and go out training pretty much straight away. It's very unlikely in that situation you're going to be able to consume enough sodium, have it into the blood, increase your thirst, and then drink a lot more before you're already out the door and halfway through your morning session. Similarly, on race morning, maybe you've got a little bit more time to prepare. So maybe there is a bit more opportunity there, but if there's a lot of other things going on, you've got to check your bike into transition, or you've got to register, or whatever it is, for depending on what event that you're doing. There's a lot of distractions going on that morning, a lot of things diverting your focus and your attention. So just having a higher level of physiological thirst is not necessarily going to translate into more fluid actually going down your throat, depending on what else is going on at the time. So, yeah, I think on the whole, it probably does make people a bit thirstier, but whether that actually translates into them drinking more, and whether, again, they need to drink more is another question. It's a little bit of a mixed bag, I'd say.
I think your point about the peanut study, or I think they were peanuts or cashews.
Yeah.
Peanuts. I think that's interesting though, because that's real world, isn't it? Say someone grabs a handful of peanuts in the morning. Okay, they may not drink a whole lot straight away, but if it actually results in them drinking over the long term, because there's a slight delay in gastric emptying or something, then okay, maybe it's a useful strategy. Eat some salted nuts before you go out, and maybe over the course of the 3 or 4 hours, because we don't know what happened beyond the 2 hours of what they studied, it may actually be beneficial. And, I think it's like you said, it's the practicality of it all, isn't it? If you're one of those athletes who wakes up in the morning and is always maybe their first pee smells and looks terrible, their second pee still looks terrible and smells terrible, you probably are hypohydrated. And therefore, you don't necessarily have to consume a lot of sodium, just drink some more water in that lead up until, getting on. Maybe you're having a slice of toast, you're having your red snack or your yellow snack, you're having your overnight oats or whatever. During that time, drink a glass of water. And then when you get on the bike, be a little bit more purposeful in drinking some water if you're always hypohydrated.
And I think if you're at that stage where you're being conscious about it, well, then you can choose to drink a certain amount of fluid anyway. So whether you drive that first or not is probably less important. Then it comes to our next point, which is more around sodium actually helping retain that fluid, which we'll get to shortly.
Yeah. I just want to, before we go on to that, I think you also had a lovely section on the chronically hypohydrated athlete and the implications of this, because I think, like, as a practitioner, like you're speaking and you'll see these recommendations for these athletes, like, yes, you need to consume some sodium because that can help drive the thirst. But I think there was a really nice section on, like, what is the bigger picture for that hyperhydrated athlete? Can you just expand on that? And you sort of did with some of the anxiety and what.
So, yeah, I mean, if someone is constantly, and we probably see this more in professional team sports where they do a lot of sort of hydration testing when people arrive at practice or training sessions, where they arrive and they're constantly below what they would kind of consider quote unquote optimal from a hydration point of view. And some of that is around sort of behavioral things that you can try and put in place. Some of that is around sort of cues in the environment. Someone like that, maybe you do want the big water bottle that they have in the car with them on the way to practice or training or whatever to encourage that fluid consumption. I guess it's a little bit different if you're waking up first thing in the morning and you've got half an hour and you've got to be out the door to your swim squad or your run session or your group ride or whatever it is. So it is going to be different for different people. But at the end of the day, the main issue if you're dehydrated is the fluid. So that's the thing that you need to focus on first. And so here, what we're talking about is maybe the sodium will give you a bit of an extra drive to drink. But if the fluid's not available at the time that you have that drive to drink, well, you can't drink it anyway. And there's nothing worse than feeling really thirsty and there's no water available. So, you've got to fix that environmental aspect around fluid availability before you worry about the sodium aspect of driving that drinking.
Yeah. And that's just the practical tip, isn't it? Like, have some water available. You don't need the 5-gallon big water Stanley cup, but having a small 500 ml bottle in the car, if you are driving wherever you're going to the pool, maybe it is just a case of trying to get that down and you'll probably benefit from it. So big tip, have your water available, people. That's probably the best thing. And as Al said, it's not necessarily a sodium issue. It's maybe a fluid issue and a water issue. Okay. Rationale 2, increasing total body sodium in anticipation of losses during exercise. I definitely see this, definitely see the fear factor in athletes. They're like, I've got to take in heaps of sodium because I'm going to lose a heap during exercise. Can we explain total body sodium and the rationale of potentially loading up?
Yeah, so this is something that I've certainly seen a lot of as well over the years. And so it was something I particularly wanted to focus on during my PhD, and that was probably almost 10 years ago now, was this concept of if you load up on sodium, what does that do or not do, essentially. So I think where this came from, or certainly from my perspective, and I came into the industry probably in the mid-2000s, was at a time where sweat sodium testing, I should say, was sort of taking off as a service for athletes and was able to identify the salty sweaters. And I think this message often came attached to the results of those sort of studies or tests with athletes. So if I was identified as a salty sweater, I might be encouraged to load up on sodium beforehand to try and create a buffer for when I then exercise. So that was kind of, I think, the rationale or where a lot of this has come from. And it's kind of, we think theoretically it's almost based on this assumption that we've got a certain amount of sodium in the body, like this store of it, a bit like glycogen for carbohydrate, and that, as I start to sweat, I'm going to lose sodium from this store, and then when it falls to a certain critical level, bad things are going to happen, essentially, whether that's cramping, whether that's hyponatremia, whether, whatever, insert problem here kind of thing. But I think, what we understand about sodium now is that's not how it works. And again, coming back to the kidneys, we can try and load up on sodium, but we know from the day-to-day stuff that we spoke about before, the kidneys aren't having any of that. They'll just pee out all that extra sodium. And so what I did during my PhD is that study I mentioned before where we had looked at sodium intake and then sweat sodium concentration is we had 3 different levels of sodium intake. So we had people's normal intake, so that's what I mentioned before. Then we used salt capsules to give them a really high salt intake, about double what they normally have. And then placebo capsules combined with a low salt diet, which they had with the high capsules as well, to give them a really low salt diet. And so we have sort of very low, normal, and then very high. And what we found basically is that they collected the urine over the 3 days, and the urine reflected the amount of sodium they were consuming, as you would expect. And so basically people can load up on sodium, and we chose 3 days in that study because when we surveyed people, also as part of the PhD, that was typically the amount of time that people would load up on sodium before a race, was about 2 to 3 days. So we did it for 3 days. And basically what we saw is that they peed out the vast majority of that sodium that they'd loaded up on by the time they actually arrived at the start of exercise. Now, not all of it, but the majority of it. Now, if you look at another type of study, which I haven't done myself, but I know others that have, is the pre-exercise hyperhydration. So that's where you're trying to actually end up overhydrated at the start of exercise. In those studies, you're only looking at the 4 hours before exercise. And so they give people a lot of water and then a lot of salt to help retain that water. And then they can measure how much both water and sodium they pee out. And so when you compare a study where they only took a large amount of sodium for 4 hours prior to exercise or 3 days prior to exercise, the amount of sodium that was retained in the body was about the same. So that tells us that there's no point loading up on sodium for days before exercise because you're just going to pee it out anyway. So if you really want to load up on sodium, you can achieve the same thing in 4 hours that you could in 3 days.
Yeah, okay. And that's probably the key takeaway there is taking it for multiple days, no real benefit, versus taking it on a single day if there is a purpose for taking in an extra amount of sodium to, as you said, hyperhydrate, which is the next part, rationale 3, which we'll get into around sodium intake improves fluid retention for achieving pre-exercise euhydration, i.e. being hydrated, or hyperhydration. Before we get to that, what is the reasons why athletes may want to increase total body sodium? Like what have you seen anecdotally and also from the research? Like where does that rationale come from?
Yeah, I think 3 things. One I mentioned before is just anxiety driven by sweat sodium testing. I have a high sodium loss during exercise, therefore I need to try and get ahead of that loss by loading up beforehand. As we said, doesn't really work apart from that acute little period before exercise anyway. And as we'll get to in part 2, personally, I don't think that actually really matters for that purpose. Often it's cramping. I'm a cramper, so if I load up on sodium, I'll be less prone to cramping. No evidence that it works. And the same with hyponatremia. And again, that doesn't work because your body's going to figure out all the lumps and bumps prior to exercise. We actually do store some sodium in our body already, but it probably won't be released if you start developing hyponatremia by over drinking during exercise, which is the main reason that you would develop hyponatremia. Because if you think about it, if you're overhydrated, which is generally how hyponatremia develops, the last thing you want is releasing more sodium into the blood that encourages more fluid retention. That's going to make it even harder for the kidneys to get rid of the excess fluid. So it makes absolutely no sense why you would do that. And the research shows that it doesn't happen anyway in a clinical population. We haven't really got that research in athletes, but certainly in pretty extreme medical scenarios, we don't see that.
Okay, that's good. And you mentioned something that's going to apply to rationale 3. You mentioned the sweat sodium testing that is fairly common practice now. I'd say it's fairly common practice. With those athletes that do get that tested, where do you see, or do you see any value in that testing? And of that value, how does that relate to then rationale 3, which is sodium intake improves fluid retention for achieving pre-exercise hydration status or hyperhydration?
Yeah, well, I mean, we'll get into it more in the next episode, but for me, the reason that you do sweat sodium testing is about the sodium you replace during exercise. It's got nothing to do with what you do beforehand. I don't think there's any evidence at the moment that the results of that test would change what you do prior to exercise in any way, shape, or form. And in fact, what we saw, and then the main reason I did that study actually as part of the PhD was we know going all the way back to World War II that if you go on a really high or really low salt diet, you can actually shift your sweat sodium concentration. Some people argue about how much. We found for that 3-day intervention that I mentioned before, yes, it did shift it in both directions, but not by that much. It was only like 10 to 12%. But if you do it over a longer period of time, like a week, as some of those studies back in World War II did, you can see a more dramatic shift in sweat sodium concentration. So originally, I guess the thinking that I had 10 years ago when I did that study is, well, are people loading up on sodium because they have a high sweat sodium concentration simply going to make their sweat even saltier when it comes to race day and kind of defeat the purpose of it? It's like almost a circular argument. So, and the answer was yes, but not by as much as we had expected. But at the same time, I can't see any rationale for the loading up beforehand based on a high sweat sodium concentration.
Yeah, and I guess that's because my understanding is that the guidelines that are set out for sodium and fluid replacement for hyperhydration are pretty set regardless, like it's effective regardless if you're a super salty sweater or a low sweater. Taking it in actually still has the same impact. So those test results, as you say, probably don't have any impact on the idea of hyperhydrating. It's interesting you say, anecdotally speaking, I've had that experience with several athletes where they have had this testing, and I will also preface this that they used to suffer from a lot of cramps. Now, we obviously then focused on their hydration. Now, it's always interesting, isn't it? The athlete puts it down to sodium intake. I put it down to fluid balance. And it's probably a combination of both. And as a practitioner, you've got to sort of go with the flow with a little bit and allow the athlete to sort of, experiment, things like that. But I can think of one particular athlete where he started taking in a hell of a lot more sodium, but he also started drinking a lot more fluid in relation to his sweat loss, which was very high. What he started noticing was that he had extreme white patches all over his outfit as a result of during exercise. What we then started doing, once we sort of felt like his fluid intake was actually really great through repeated sweat rate testing in Fuel In, was, hey, why don't we do an experiment and see if we drop your sodium intake, not to zero. He still took in sodium, but we dropped it. He was taking in like 1,500 milligrams per liter. And we said, let's drop that by half and see what happens. Maintained his fluid intake. Suddenly all the white marks went. Literally, he had no more white marks on him, no cramping, no gut issues or anything like that. Performance stayed very high. So I sort of look at it as a practitioner. It was like win-win in sort of a lot of ways, because it was like, okay, the athlete felt, they were in control. They wanted to take more sodium. It's a supplement. Everyone likes taking a supplement. It's sort of like the magic dust. I got him taking in more fluid in line with what he needed. Then we sort of had that full circle, kumbaya, maybe we don't need this, let's test. And it still had a very positive result. And I would encourage athletes to do that. Maybe your sodium intake was very low. Maybe it will help you with maybe some of the cramping, maybe drinking a bit more fluid. My personal rationale is that it's the fluid balance that makes the biggest difference for things like cramping and GI and all that. But if you need to use some sodium to prove that, and then gradually use yourself as a, N=1 and reduce the sodium, you might save yourself, the need to take in all this extra sodium, which, as you said, you're just probably losing anyway. You're pissing it out. So I don't know. Have you had that experience with athletes where they've sort of wanted to take in a lot of sodium because of what they've read online? You manage their hydration, their fluid balance, and then gradually encourage them. Have you had that experience?
I probably haven't had any that I've had exactly that story with, but I've had certainly a few that have sort of said, oh, yeah, I used to take all this sodium and then I backed it off and realized I didn't need it. It wasn't actually doing anything for me. So, yeah, I've definitely had that experience.
Yeah. And look, I'm not saying that athletes don't need sodium, as I said at the very start. I do think that some sodium in their fluid during exercise, which again will be a later episode, I think is beneficial for a lot of athletes for probably a number of reasons. but I think it is one of those ones, just being mindful of the amount of sodium you're taking in. I think that's probably the biggest thing. And that's where I do get a little bit concerned with the amount of sodium being consumed, as we said, on a day-to-day basis, but even pre-exercise, especially if it's not intentional for a purpose of, say, hyperhydration or getting yourself up to a hydrated state because you're already hydrated. So let's talk about hyperhydration in particular. This is rationale 3. Sodium intake improves fluid retention for achieving pre-exercise hydration or hyperhydration status. What are the guidelines in terms of fluid amount and sodium content to assist with improving hydration status pre-exercise?
So the general guidelines, if you just want to be adequately hydrated, is to consume about 5 to 10 milliliters of fluid per kilo of body weight in the roughly 2 to 4 hours prior to exercise. And the 2 to 4 hours, the rationale in the guidelines is that if you give yourself enough time to consume that fluid, have it digested, absorbed into the body, and then pee out any excess if it was excess, essentially. And they also do say consuming a bit of sodium with that, and we'll get into this in a second, will help with the retention of that fluid. The 5 to 10 mils of fluid per kilo of body weight translates into 0.5% to 1% of body weight. So if you want to think of that in terms of, well, how much do I lose during exercise, or how much am I trying to replace, it's 0.5 to 1%. For hyperhydration, we're trying to go a step further than that. So rather than just trying to achieve a normal sort of optimal level of hydration, you're deliberately trying to overhydrate prior to exercise. Now, there are not a lot of situations where we would recommend this for athletes, but there are a few specific ones. And they're generally events that are, one, in very hot conditions, so you're going to be sweating a lot in terms of fluid loss. 2, the exercise is usually fairly high intensity, which also exacerbates, obviously, that sweat rate because you're just burning more calories, producing more body heat, you're going to sweat more. But also the ability to access, drink, swallow, tolerate that fluid is probably worse. There are limited opportunities, or they're shorter, more intense events where, slowing down to get fluid is not an option. It's a competitive disadvantage to do that. So that the events that I've generally seen this used in would be things like marathons in hot conditions. So often the marathon at the Olympic Games is a classic example where we see hyperhydration being used, because obviously your big city marathons are deliberately timed to be in the cooler times of the year. Generally it is pretty cool, but you get to Tokyo or Paris for the Olympic Games, it's often 20 degrees hotter than they're used to normally running a marathon in. And so that's when you often see it used. The race walk events at the Olympics is another one where they've been used quite a lot. Olympic distance triathlon in very hot conditions at the elite level, again, is another example of that. But in triathlon, it's a little bit different because obviously on the bike, you've got a bit more access to fluid than you do running a marathon. So it's generally been those running events where I've seen this used. The great irony is that most of the research is done in cycling, and there may be critical differences between running and cycling that we can get into later that mean that it's actually more useful for cycling than running, but probably less necessary in cycling than running because you can carry your fluids with you and you've got more access to fluid during the event itself.
It's interesting with that though, Al, sorry if I'm cutting,
that's right.
Because if you think of one of the negative side effects of hyperhydration is weight gain. And then you're doing it in an event like a marathon or a short course, Olympic triathlon, where being heavier for the run probably is a disadvantage. So then you're weighing up as a practitioner, as an athlete, do I want to be hyperhydrated, potentially carrying more weight? Is that going to be a negative versus, completely, melting down on the course? And so again, it's not as straightforward, is it? As people might be going, oh, okay, so any hot race, I'm going to use hyperhydration. It's like, well, think about why you want to do it and what the potential positive or the pros could be, but also the negative impact of that hyperhydration.
Yeah, totally. And when you get to long course events, whether that's long course triathlon or ultra marathon type distances, a couple of things are going to happen. One, the pace is lower, so your sweat rate is generally going to be lower for any given weather conditions. But 2, because the event's longer, that hyperhydration effect will be a lot smaller because, well, you can only hyperhydrate to a certain extent, and as a percentage of the total fluid loss, it's going to get smaller and smaller the longer the event goes. So generally, I haven't seen it used in long course racing really at all. And certainly I've never recommended it to anyone for long course racing. So, it's an interesting one.
I have recommended it for long course Ironman with an athlete who had an extraordinarily high sweat rate, and and we're not going to discuss it, but he used glycerol, and it he had a positive outcome with it. Now, whether it was because of that or he just was actually really on point with his fluid strategy throughout the race, and I think that it probably came down to that more, that he was actually on point with his fluid consumption on the bike and on the run, as much as potentially hyperhydrating him beforehand. So I've definitely done it. Do I do it routinely? No. I think most athletes struggle with it as well from a glycerol perspective and whatnot. So, okay, so you've covered what is hyperhydration. Why would you do it? How do you do it?
Yeah. So before I said that sort of 5 to 10 mils per kilo of fluid, so 0.5 to 1% of body mass, basically. With hyperhydration, you're just taking that a big step forward. So you're now looking at, most of the research studies are in the 20 to 25 mils per kilo. So basically 2 to 2.5% of body weight of fluid that you're consuming in the roughly 4 hours prior to exercise. Now, if we take a step back to what we were saying earlier, that, why do we need these daily electrolyte supplements, is because if we drink a lot of fluid, we just pee it all out again if we're having a big lot in one go. Well, this is exactly what we're doing here. So this is one time where taking sodium with that fluid will be important, because it will help you retain that fluid. And if you don't take any sodium, you probably won't retain any of that fluid, and you may actually lose even more than what you drank in the first place. So this is where you would want to consume the sodium with the fluid. Now, because you're trying to increase basically the volume of fluid in the body, and the blood is where that sort of gets regulated from an osmolality point of view, what you're trying to do from a sodium perspective is consume enough sodium that as you drink all of that fluid, it's not dropping the osmolality of your blood. So to do that, you've got to try and get that sodium in the fluid. It could be with capsules and then fluid, or in the fluid itself, to a concentration that is as close to blood sodium concentration as you can tolerate. So that's somewhere around the kind of 300 milligrams per 100 mils, or 3,000 milligrams per liter of fluid that you're consuming. That's a lot of sodium, probably more than double what most people would actually consume during exercise. So this is a very salty mix. Capsules can help from that from a flavor perspective. But if you put a whole bunch of capsules into your stomach at once, you can get nausea or even vomiting, particularly with the gelatin capsules that dissolve almost instantaneously. The methyl cellulose, the vegan capsules, dissolve a bit more slowly. That can be helpful. Or just space them out a little bit as you drink that fluid, or put the sodium in the fluid. Generally is relatively well tolerated. It's just very salty, doesn't taste great.
Two things there. Maybe the water doesn't hyperhydrate should be the quote, rather than water doesn't hydrate.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe we can coin that, and maybe everyone else will coin it as well. But certainly I think it's a great point you make there, that this is a great reason now to use sodium, because it does work. High amounts of sodium with high amounts of water will hyperhydrate you if that's your purpose. So go for it. And that's where these products can work well. Your point there around the saltiness, yeah. So roughly 3,000 milligrams is generally what I'm recommending per liter. That is if I use the example of Precision Hydration, for instance, that is 4 of their 1,500 milligram tabs, pH 15. That is salty. Like, you drink that and you're like, oh God, it is pretty, like, I've had it myself, and then also other athletes, they're like, ooh, that is really salty. You really want me to drink that? And it's like, if you want to do this and we want to use it, then yes, that's what you need to do. Now, with encouragement, they generally will do it, but it's not always that pleasant for a lot of people, because, as you say, it's just the palatability of that saltiness. So it is something that I think, either whether you practice it or not, you certainly want to practice it before race day if you're going to do it before race day, but just actually try it and you'll get an understanding of how salty this beverage is in order to hyperhydrate.
And that's where, you may opt for glycerol instead of sodium, or a mix, sort of half-half. to try and achieve that. So glycerol also impacts on the osmolality, not just in the blood, but inside the cells, and that's probably a difference between the two. But it can have a similar effect if taken in the correct dose, which we won't get into today. It's another whole podcast.
Yeah, I think we'll leave glycerol on the side for another one. What about the form of sodium? So sodium chloride, powder versus capsules versus tablets versus sodium bicarb versus sodium citrate. What's the evidence show?
Yeah, so there is one study that's looked at the sodium in the fluid versus in capsules, found that in the fluid was slightly better, but only slightly. So both of them will work, but maybe in the fluid will be slightly more effective. And it's probably just to do with how quickly or slowly those capsules break down, empty from the stomach, release that sodium. Is that sodium getting into the blood before or after the fluid, or at about the same time as the fluid, versus if it's all in the one mix, it's kind of arriving together, so to speak. In terms of the form of sodium, so traditionally most sports drinks have been sodium chloride, which is just your basic table salt. But particularly in the last 10 years or so, there's been a big shift towards using sodium citrate rather than sodium chloride. This is a big unanswered question in the research. There are really no studies that are directly comparing the two. From a theoretical point of view, there may be differences simply because citrate is going to behave differently to the chloride element in terms of how it affects the osmolality of the blood. And that's really what you're trying to do here, is you're trying to maintain the osmolality as you increase all this fluid that would normally drop that osmolality and dilute everything. You're just preventing that from happening. So theoretically, there could be differences there, but it hasn't been studied to date. So there's been a bicarb versus citrate study, but not versus sodium chloride study.
Okay, and we're not going to get into the sodium bicarb, but it is one of the things I think a lot of athletes need to be aware of, that you will get a very high sodium load when doing bicarb, as if you are doing sodium bicarbonate as another supplement to try and improve performance, you will also get this extreme sodium load, definitely above, I think it's well above 3,000 milligrams, isn't it, when you do the full load, depending on how heavy you are, I guess, as an athlete, because it is, again, weight dependent.
And also, like, I think with the amount of fluid, like that 20 to 25 milligrams, mils per kilo, I have met athletes, including some who did run the marathon in Tokyo, that did it but chose to drink a smaller quantity because they just found the gastrointestinal discomfort in the hours leading up to the marathon. Plus, again, as we were talking about earlier, like all the other logistical things that you're doing in the lead up to a race, that's a lot of fluid that you got to get through. It's got to sit in your stomach and empty and be absorbed to feel comfortable. And so you can opt for a sort of like a half-hearted hyperhydration, I suppose, going like 10 to 15 mils per kilo. And I guess that's the important thing here, is that then you have to scale the sodium back as you're scaling the water back. So think about the sodium in milligrams per litre of the fluid, decide how many litres of fluid you're going to drink, and then base the sodium around that volume. Whereas in the research, they tend to be described quite separately. And so the recommendations are drink this much fluid and have this much sodium. It's like, no, because if you then drink less fluid and you put all that sodium in, you're going to overdo the sodium and cause other problems. So match the sodium to the volume of fluid. And so if you end up drinking more or less, then you're going to have more or less sodium as well. And so the whole idea here with sodium, and probably the theme of these 3 episodes really, is going to be that sodium is there to complement what you're doing with the fluid. But the fluid is the bit that primarily drives the need or lack of need for the sodium.
Yeah. So in practical terms, if say, let's say someone was going with the 20 mils per kilogram, then would they be opting for the higher range of sodium, i.e. into the 300 milligrams per 100 mils? And if they were then going down to 10 mils per kilogram, would you recommend them to go down to roughly 50% of that, say 150 milligrams? Or would you keep the milligrams the same, but they just adjust the amount of sodium based on the amount of fluid? Yeah,
well, it's 300 milligrams per litre of fluid that you drink.
Okay, perfect.
So if you drink a litre, you're going to get 3,000. You're going to get 3,000. If you drink a litre, if you drink half a litre, you're going to get 1,500.
Perfect. And that, I think that's I just wanted to clarify that so the listeners understood that base it on the fluid amount, the sodium, the milligrams of fluid, milligrams of sodium based on the actual fluid amount, not the other way around. And then you'll be very safe with it.
Yeah. And probably the final thing I'd say here is if you're going below that 10 mils per kilo or 1% of body weight, you're probably not really in the hyperhydration territory, and so you don't need that much sodium. Like some sodium will be helpful, but you don't need to go to that extreme.
Yeah, it's sort of like you're doing, as you said, a half-hearted hyperhydration, and are you just?
Or you're just aiming for euhydration.
I was going to say you're just actually aiming to get some fluid in to probably be hydrated, but not hyperhydrated, and therefore you know just be happy with that. Does it actually result in improved performance?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? So a colleague of mine, Chris Irwin, and I did a meta-analysis of this in 2024, and we found that overall there was a slight benefit to performance. But as I said before, the majority of those studies are done in cycling, whereas most of the real-world use cases are probably lending themselves to running. There are very few studies in running, and the ones that have generally not shown as much positive results. There was also, at that time, a lack of studies in female athletes compared to male athletes. There is one study exclusively in female athletes that's just been published in the last sort of 6 to 12 months now since we did that meta-analysis. So that's good, and it showed similar effects in females and males. And there's very little in very elite athletes compared to sort of competitive or recreational athletes. So again, no reason to suggest that it wouldn't be as effective in elite athletes, but we don't have that data. So as I said, it's pretty limited use cases, I think, where it is beneficial. There's still question marks with running in particular because the energy cost of running is proportional to your body weight. So the more weight you're carrying around, the more calories you have to expend, the more oxygen you've got to bring in, et cetera, to move that extra weight as well. And cycling uphill is the same. So, yeah, it's hard to make firm conclusions on that. But I guess to say unless you're trying to win trophies or prize money, this may be not a strategy that you would go to. It certainly wouldn't be a first choice or a high priority strategy.
I think actually that's why we did it as well, is because I remember looking at it thinking, okay, it's been done in cyclists. If we can get the athlete coming off the bike in a euhydrated or hydrated state, because I think his common complaint was, I just feel like I'm out of fluid, by the time I get off the bike. And the rationale was, let's not start the marathon 3% dehydrated. Let's try and start in a hydrated state. I think that was sort of the rationale. And I think like if we think about what we've done with Fuel In with the sweat rate testing as well, we actually bumped up the fluid recommendation to 70-80% of fluid replacement as opposed to running where it's 60 to 70%. And that probably, again, more applicable if you're a cyclist, okay, you'll be fine. But also from a triathlete perspective, if we can hopefully maintain some sort of hydration status coming off the bike going into that run, maybe you're in a better position. But yeah, we don't know at this point in time. It's field based, and it's what we are tending to see just anecdotally. Okay, last one. Rationale 4: sodium restriction induces body water, body mass losses for acute weight manipulation. And I guess, look, for majority of endurance athletes, maybe this isn't that important. Maybe cycling, you did mention cycling, and you can touch on that. But I certainly had experience with this with the America's Cup, where we had to get sailors have an acute weight drop. Our focus was mainly on fluid balance, not necessarily on reducing total sodium intake. We have a lot of interest from UFC fighters in using Fuel In, so I'm sure this section in particular will probably grab their attention. So can you explain short versus long time manipulation of sodium intake on total body water?
Yeah, so this actually wasn't originally in the paper when I wrote it. It was actually one of the reviewers who came back and suggested this in the context of cycling, but it's relevant in terms of weight category sports as well. So this is where people have to weigh in below a certain level prior to competition. So as you said, MMA is an example, boxing, both amateur and professional boxing, taekwondo, etc. Lightweight rowing, although that's not really much of a thing now. It's out of the Olympics. It's a lot smaller than it used to be. So the idea here is because sodium helps retain fluid, if we remove or drastically cut the sodium in someone's diet in those couple of days prior to the weigh-in, we can actually help retain less fluid and lower body weight during that time. Now, obviously, as an endurance athlete, that body weight retained is water, and that's hydration. That's a good thing, prior to a race or something like that, or a key training session. But if you're trying to weigh in below a certain amount and then you've got time to rehydrate prior to competition, then that's a different story. Interestingly, though, most of the research the evidence that's been quoted in this around guidelines is kind of a little bit theoretical, and I think probably misinterpreted a little bit. I'd say there is really a lack of research in this area to make strong conclusions one way or the other. Again, coming back to that study I did through my PhD, we did see slightly higher body weight prior to exercise after the high sodium diet, but actually between the normal sodium intake and the low sodium intake, we didn't see any difference in body weight. So possibly if you're coming from a really high sodium intake and cutting it very drastically, you might see a difference. But from a sort of a quote unquote normal intake and cutting it a bit, you're probably not going to see much difference. But there's really a lack of clear research in athletes in this specific kind of use case to really get a good sense of what's going on here.
Yeah, and I think of those athletes as well. A lot of these weight category sports are actually usually quite small athletes, but then get up in weight and then try and come back down. So you wonder what their energy intake is. With that, as we discussed before, high energy intakes will result in higher sodium intake. So I guess it probably maybe actual body weight of the athlete could have an impact on this. And maybe, as you say, if they do have a very high sodium intake on a daily basis, maybe purposely reducing it could have an impact, but maybe for a lot it won't. There are some dangers of this, though. Can you outline just specifically why there is a potential danger for this for these weight category athletes? And I've certainly seen this in practice, and I just love you to just outline this clearly, because unfortunately we have seen deaths in fighting or combat sports as a result of this practice.
Yep. So this usually comes when this sodium restriction is combined with another practice called water loading. So this is done just prior to the final weight cut. So maybe 3 or 4 days out from the weigh-in, they'll load up on huge amounts of water. And the reason that they do this is when they suddenly restrict their fluid the next day, you get this sort of hangover effect, if you like, of the body peeing out excess fluid. So the idea is if you load up on water prior to this water restriction, when you do restrict the water, it's even more effective in terms of peeing out a bit more. Now, that does seem to work. There has been some studies in doing that. The concern has been if you cut the sodium at the same time and you consume all this fluid, are you going to develop hyponatremia? So this is hyponatremia at rest. It's not even during exercise. But generally what we see is that so that was the concern that was kind of theoretically raised. Research that's been done since that concern was raised has suggested no, because the body's pretty good at peeing out that extra fluid that you consume anyway without any consequence, and that is the normal scenario. Retaining all of that fluid and developing hyponatremia is actually fairly rare considering how many times people overhydrate, but it is theoretically possible. So, it's probably something that is more of a theoretical risk, something rather than something that's actually seen, but I think there are rare cases where it does or can happen.
Yeah, no, perfect. I think it's just something for, athletes to be aware of if you are being recommended this practice of, water loading, as you said, combined with the low sodium, that it is a theoretical risk. And my understanding is there have been some unfortunate cases of hyponatremia at rest, and that's had dire consequences. So, okay. So I guess the big takeaways from before exercise is multiple days of sodium loading, probably a waste of money and a waste of your time, because actually doing it acutely is effective if you want to achieve trying to get hydrated or hyperhydrated. So it can be done. Sodium can work very, very effectively with the right amount of fluid if it's done based on the guidelines we mentioned before. What do we say? Roughly 275 to 420 milligrams per 100 mils?
Yeah, so your 300 or your 3,000 per litre is sort of the middle range of that, but that's the typical range you see in studies, yeah.
Okay, so let's just say for people, if this is something that you're going to attempt, around that 3,000 milligrams per litre is what generally is recommended. And if you're going to do it, definitely try it before your race, if that's something that you think you need to do, and experience what it tastes like, because you just may not like it. And also it may not be required, but that's up to you. Al, I know I'm glad that we decided to cut this into 3 sections because this would have been a Huberman style 4.5 hour podcast. I love this paper. I think it's probably the start, is how I view it, of like everyone's starting to think a little bit more about sodium, how it can be beneficial, but how maybe it's not beneficial for certain people. And maybe not effective for certain people as well, when we're talking about on a daily basis and before exercise. So, I think, as we said off air, it's not that we're saying sodium is not required. It's just think about your purpose. And that's what we always say with Fuel In, is what is your purpose? Think about that and use performance nutrition and the science available to guide your decision making. And I think what your paper's done is start to get practitioners to think about that. I think hopefully it's informed some companies to think about their messaging, and also for athletes who either listen to this podcast or read the paper. And the paper is fully available online, and we will have the link in the show notes. Have a read of it, get some decisions. We'd love comments on this episode, what you've learned from it, what you take away, what you do. And then we'll go from there. But as I said, we've broken it into the first part. Next part is going to be during exercise, which I think is probably where most attention for this paper I saw on social media was received. Like a lot of practitioners, even a lot of athletes, bringing up some beautiful flow charts, some graphs, and saying, hey, we need to think about this when we're thinking about prescription of sodium during exercise. So I'm looking forward to getting into that one. Mate, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I think the key two overarching things here is you can fool your kidneys for a couple of hours, but you can't fool them for much longer than that, which is kind of talks to what you're saying before. And then finally, as I said before, and this will be a theme across all 3 episodes, is really the point of sodium here is to balance what you're doing from a fluid perspective. And so think fluid first, and then think, what sodium do I need to match up with what I'm doing from a fluid perspective?
Couldn't have said it better myself, mate. So you being the expert, I expect that. So look, we'll get the next one out as soon as we can once we record that. But mate, until then, thanks for chatting, and we'll chat to you soon.
Will do. Thank you.